So just to introduce myself, I'm Ken Reaves. I'm the campus dean for Georgia Highlands College in our Marietta instructional site. Been with Georgia Highlands about 23 years. I started my career in human resources for this company called Temple Inland, which no longer exists, and I came here, my family and I came here in about 2000, and I started working for Georgia Highlands in 2001 in human resources. Spent some time in the Navy. I'm a second class petty officer and intelligence specialist, Gulf War veteran, and have a master's degree from Troy State University and a specialist degree from the University of Georgia. Go Dogs. What got me interested in this subject? One of the things, I'm a history buff, and one of our church mothers asked my wife and I to join the Emancipation Proclamation Committee. Didn't know really that much about it, heard about the document, but didn't really know a lot about it as far as its historical context and importance to the country. And once I started investigating its context and how important it was historically to our nation, it really piqued my interest. And one of the things that I usually say at our meetings is that I think without the Emancipation Proclamation, we probably don't have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So it was really an important document to the life of the United States, but specifically the life of African Americans. And I guess in addition to one of the things that it did, it allowed African American men to join the Union Navy and Army. So over 200,000, those men got to fight for their freedom. I think the most impactful thing that I found during the research is that the Emancipation Proclamation, even though it freed slaves, it didn't free slaves in all the states. Some of the border states like Kentucky, which considered itself neutral, it didn't affect any of those people that were slaves in those states. And I thought that was really interesting. The other interesting thing is that it was a military measure. And so Lincoln did that as probably one of the ways to hurt the South as far as continuing with the war. And I think once those slaves found out that they would be freed on January 1, 1863, that would cause some consternation in the South. And another thing that I think was really interesting about the Emancipation Proclamation is that we have a tradition here in the African American church that called watch night services, and that's one of the things that the folks did at the churches during that time. They were waiting and hoping that the Emancipation Proclamation would be true. And they started on the December 31st of 1862 and 1863. The January 1st is then when they celebrate, and they call it watch night services. And that's been over 150 years ago, and African American churches across the nation still celebrate watch night services.
It got quiet. Y'all must be ready to start. Good evening and welcome to the Bartow History Museum's evening lecture for February 2024. Glad to have you out tonight. My name is Trey Gaines. I'm director of the museum, and on behalf of the staff, we're glad you're here. I just have a very few announcements tonight before we get started, but I do want to mention a couple things. Today's Thursday, so Saturday will be the last day that our current temporary exhibit on medical history here in Bartow County will be open, so it will close after Saturday. So if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go take a look and check it out and enjoy that while it's still here. And then next month, on March the 21st, we'll open a new exhibit on the history of cameras and photography. We've got a large collection of cameras in our collection here at the museum that we're going to bring out and show off and talk a little bit about the evolution of the camera. And I will mention that will open on March the 21st, which is not the traditional last Thursday evening lecture that we typically have every month. So if you come to those regularly, note that new date. That's the Thursday prior to our normal date. And what we're doing is we're going to open that exhibit with a reception and a preview of the exhibit, and then we're going to go up to the Booth Museum for a program on photographer Dorothea Lange, who was a well-known photographer and did a lot of Western type photography. And her granddaughter and a family friend will be here to talk about her and her life and her work. So we're going to join the booth that evening for their lecture and open our exhibit at the same time. So that's March the 21st. It's also the third week of March, which means that if we had a lunch and learn, typically on the third Wednesday, that would be the day before. So we're not having a lunch and learn in March of 2024. I know that was confusing, but so keep it simple. No lunch and learn in March. Join us a week early for our evening lecture on March 21st for that exhibit opening and lecture at the booth. Okay. And all that information can be found on our website. If you are a member of the museum, you should be getting emails from us. But you can also find that at bartowhistorymuseum.org or follow us on social media. Well, without further ado, let me introduce our special guest for the evening. Ken Reaves is currently the campus dean at Georgia Highlands College, the Marietta Instructional Site. He began his career as the Director of Human Resources for Georgia Highlands College and has over 15 years' experience in human resources management. Ken has a BA in political science from the University of Tennessee, an MPA in public personnel management from Troy State University, and a specialist degree in learning, leadership, and organizational development from UGA. He is a Gulf War veteran, serving as a U.S. Naval Intelligence Specialist, Petty Officer 2nd Class. Ken is very active in the community with participation in Kiwanis of Marietta, Advisory Board Chair for the United Way of Cobb County, as well as co-chair of the Emancipation Proclamation Committee of Bartow County. He enjoys reading, exercise, and travel. Ken is married to Sherry, who's joining us as well this evening. And they have 2 sons, Christopher and Brandon. Please join me in welcoming Ken Reaves.
Thank you. Thank you to the Bartow History Museum for the invitation today, and it gives me the opportunity to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation Committee of Bartow County. My wife and I have been on the committee for about 15 years, I think. And we were asked to join the committee by a church mother, and she's a current member, though she's in her 90s. And I knew of the Emancipation Proclamation, but I didn't know a lot about its historical context to the United States. You know, as history is taught, I didn't know about Juneteenth until we moved to Texas about in 1993. So it's not unusual that I didn't know a whole lot about the Emancipation Proclamation. So what we're going to talk about today, I want to give a little bit of a historical context, and I think why the Emancipation Proclamation is so important to folks who are of African ancestry. So in this slide is just a depiction of the first time that slaves and indentured servants first came to the United States. These folks were captured, about 20 or 30 of them, and they were captured from the San Juan Bautista, and they came to the shores of Fort Comfort, Virginia, which is now Fort Monroe, Virginia, in Hampton, Virginia, on the ship named the White Lion in 1619. So in the following decades, these folks and their offspring would encounter a pretty rapid societal decline into chattel slavery. As a matter of fact, from 1619 to 1662, the legislatures of Virginia passed a legislation that the status of a child would be inherited from their mother. So you want to have perpetual, continual slavery. So that wasn't a very long period of time, from 1619 to 1692 to 1662, where this particular thing happened. So the dream and pursuit of freedom was always paramount to the people of African descent in this new nation. So you fast forward 240 years and 240 years of enslavement for African Americans, and now the country is at war. It continues to be debated that the Civil War was fought by the North to prevent the succession of Southern states and to preserve the Union, even though conflicts of slavery was a major cause of the war. Ending slavery initially was not the goal, but the South, and documentation that you can find with the South, was very clear in its desire to maintain slavery for economic and societal purposes. So hostilities are going on a little over 2 years when the proclamation was drafted, and on September 22nd, actually, of 1862, President Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which stated that enslaved people in those states or parts of states still in rebellion as of January 1, 1863, would be declared henceforth and forever free. The Emancipation Proclamation officially was Proclamation 95, and it was a presidential proclamation and an executive order. I think it was very revolutionary at its time, but this is the first time in U.S. history that this type of declaration had come from the federal government's executive branch. But because it was a military measure, it was limited in many ways. One, It applied only to states that had seceded from the Union. Those are tan-colored states, the ones that seceded from the Union. And it was leaving slavery basically untouched in the border states like Kentucky. Kentucky considered itself neutral during the Civil War. It also expressly exempted parts of the Confederacy that had already come under Union control. And you can see those in the blue, those are already under Union control. In the red-colored areas, these were occupied by Union troops, and the slaves were immediately freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. But the important thing to remember is that freedom through the proclamation was promised only depending on if the Union won the war. If the Union had lost the war, then the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, would have been null and void. But I think more importantly, concerning the Emancipation Proclamation, is that African Americans, for the first time, they accepted black men into the Union Army and Union Navy. And so by the end of the war, over 200,000 soldiers and sailors had fought for the Union and for their freedom. So the liberated became liberators. Now, I don't know. So why is January 1 important? So we're going to talk about some of that here. I don't know if President Lincoln at the time knew the significance of January 1. Maybe the day was just turned because of the first day of the year. But I'm not really sure if he knew the significance of January 1 to African Americans. So during this time, January 1 was known as Hiring Day or Heartbreak Day. And the slave people spent New Year's Eve waiting and wondering if their owners were going to rent them out to someone else, thus potentially splitting up their families. According to Alexis McCrossan, is an expert in the history of New Year's Eve and New Year's Day and a professor of history at the Southern Methodist University. She said more enslaved people were separated from their families on New Year's Day than at any other time. The renting of slave labor was a relatively common practice in antebellum South and a profitable practice for white slave owners and hires. Hiring Day or New Year's Day was part of the larger economic cycle by which most debts were collected and settled. It's interesting to note that a former slave named Sister Harrison, in an interview in 1937, she said, "This is where the saying comes from that what you do on New Year's Day, you'll be doing all the rest of the year." Has anybody ever heard that saying? Never heard that saying. That's maybe it's just a saying in the African American community, but we've always heard that what you're doing on New Year's Day is what you'll be doing for the rest of the year. And so that's where that saying came from. To sort of illustrate the heartbreak of that day, Harriet Jacobs wrote in her account, The Slave's New Year's Day, in a chapter of her 1861 autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She said, "One of these fateful days, Jacob saw a mother lead 7 children to the auction block. She knew that some of them would be taken from her, but they took all. The slave trader who took the children wouldn't tell her where he was taking them because it depended on where he could get the highest price." Jacob said that she would never forget the mother crying out, "Gone, all gone. Why doesn't God just kill me?" So another significant about January 1 is that the federal ban on the transatlantic slave trade also went into effect on January 1, but this was in New Year's Day on 1808. And another thing about in the African American community, another tradition which lasts until today, there's a church service called Watch Night. And in Watch Night, this got its start when slaves went to church to pray and sing on December 31st, 1862, hoping that what they had heard about the Emancipation Proclamation was really coming to pass. So even though the theme of Watch Night has changed, but this is why even to this day on New Year's Eve, prayer services are all across the nation, basically in African American churches to bring in the new year. Watch Night, that's where it got its start. So, Bartow County, 1929. Since 1929, the Emancipation Proclamation has been celebrated and commemorated in Bartow County. And I'm not really certain why or what events were occurring in that time to inspire the citizens to begin this commemoration. I've talked to a number of old citizens of Bartow County, African American citizens. Some of them can't remember, they're in their 90s. They really can't remember why it got started, but I'm pretty sure it was a series of events that were going on during that time that inspired them to do this. Now, one thing that I do know What great thing was going on in 1929 for a quiz for the audience? What major thing was going on in 1929? It was the start of the Great Depression. So the Great Depression was just now starting in 1929, and there was turmoil at the start of the Great Depression and rumblings about military actions in Europe, Africa, and Asia, we know, that later led to the start of World War II. So all these things were going on at that time. And so to think that approximately 66 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued and 52 years at the end of Reconstruction, as you can see from the compromise, Reconstruction officially ended in 1877, even though it ended earlier in Georgia in 1870. And amid Jim Crow laws that were going on at that time, maybe these things inspired these folks to start the Emancipation Proclamation to celebrate this time, so give them a chance to celebrate something that would, amidst all these things that were going on in the community. So over the years, a committed group of faithful volunteers carried on the program, ensuring that this important day in the lives of Americans of African descent would not soon be forgotten. During the past 90 years, the committee has been able to garner some outstanding local and renowned national speakers. The first program was actually held on December 11th and didn't move to January 1 until 1936. The first speaker was the Reverend M.M. Moses Marquette Peace in 1929. He was a renowned preacher and pastor emeritus of the Monumental Baptist Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So a quiz for the audience. Who are the gentlemen in this slide? Does anybody know who the gentlemen are in this slide? Anybody? Nobody knows? That's okay. So on your left is the Dr. Benjamin Mays. He spoke at the event in 1969. Now, he was a minister and longtime president of Morehouse College and also the mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. The gentleman on the right is Martin Luther King Sr. So Martin Luther King's father, who spoke in 1970. We also have some outstanding citizens of Bartow County who spoke at the occasion. Those included Mr. J.S. Morgan. He was the principal of Sumner Hill School. He spoke in 1935, and I believe his descendants later became, the first African-American president of Cartersville High School. So, anybody from the audience know who these esteemed people are?
Supreme Court Justice Benham.
Supreme Court Justice Benham, exactly right. And the lady on the left is Miss Nancy Beasley. Miss Nancy Beasley was a longtime administrator and educator. She spoke in 1974 and 1985. Her father was Ishmael Robinson, whose father Wade, with his brother Green, owned 200 acres of land out in the Mission off Burnt Hickory in the Mission Road area. The other son, Ellis Robinson, is the father of longtime committee member Ann Robinson, a former Bartow County teacher, and the person who recruited us to this committee. Of course, as you said, the Honorable Justice Benham, he had a law office here in Cartersville. Now, I believe that the Emancipation Proclamation was the impetus to the 13th Amendment. It was ratified in 1865, which we know abolished slavery as an institution in all U.S. states and territories. Now, some argue that the 13th Amendment was started convict leasing and eventually led to mass incarceration. That's up for some debate. Also, the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born in and naturalized United States, also gave us equal protection under the law, was ratified in 1868. And also the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote, not based on race, color, previous condition of servitude, which was ratified in 1870. So I believe these amendments to the Constitution, it is debatable that without this document entering the American psyche, these amendments, would they have existed as soon as they did? I don't think they would have. So today, we celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation on a yearly basis. And what we usually do, we rotate through African-American churches in Bartow County. Have about 20 members on the committee, and we get a lot of in-kind assistance from community members. We have 2 awards that are distributed to local citizens. One is the Mentor Award, and is given to individuals that positively pour life into young people. And the Citizenship Award is given to individuals who are active in the community. We typically give out these awards to someone who is at the host church. We also provide 2 scholarships. This year was $500 to deserving students. The committee also recognizes new local African-American businesses, and this is in homage to the many past black businesses that populated Bartow County and Cartersville, like nationally known restaurant owner Hamburger Bill on Church Street, and the Cartersville Tanning Tailor Shop in the old Blue Front area, which I think is right around the corner. So we consider this commemoration to be a labor of love and an important moment in the life of the United States, a giant step to ensuring that all Americans live a life of liberty and freedom as we continue to pursue a more perfect union. And I'll take some questions. Now, if there are any questions, I'll take some questions.
I have a comment.
Sure.
I question your security in that top right-hand photo in the very back row. How did that gentleman get in there?
Had to make sure you're in the photograph, Lance.
I understand it. You had said in one other time I heard you speak on this, you spoke about the Emancipation Proclamation allowing people to serve in the military, but you also said that it played a role in keeping Europe at bay because they actually wanted to come in and protect the cotton trade, and the fear by Abraham Lincoln was that that would happen, but by bringing the message that it was really a war about ending slavery, it kept Europe at bay.
Right.
You said.
And I think, and it really, the war, and I guess you all know, the war evolved over time. And, from keeping the Union together until finally it became a war for ending slavery, which is really one of the 2 things. And so I don't know, the country has, people say that the country is divided now. I don't see how the country could be even more divided back then. We actually at war with each other. And so the cotton trade, the slave trade was such a big enterprise in the United States. And it wasn't just here in the South. They had insurance companies in the North, who manufactured the cotton. They were sending cotton overseas. European folks had investment in the United States. So it was really a worldwide enterprise. And so it's really hard to imagine the magnitude and the money that was being made. And if you try to put your place in the folks who are in the South who gaining all this wealth, I mean, that had to be a bitter pill to swallow, to say, hey, we're going to take away this lifestyle that you have become accustomed to, as wrong as it may have been, but we're going to take this away from. So, I mean, you can understand that the dynamics of, hey, you're trying to take away my livelihood. And so it's more I look at slavery, the more I read about it, I realize how tremendous it was as an enterprise, and how wealthy people became, and how it was really a global type enterprise. Anything else?
And you had said that Europe had done away with the slave trade long before we had here. So that was a brilliant political move by Abraham Lincoln, because he knew that based on their own history, they couldn't intervene. Once that became the overarching theme, they had to stay out of the Civil War.
Right. Had to stay out of the Civil War. Interestingly, and I mean, slavery ended in Europe long before it ended in the United States, but we know that's slavery got its start. Chattel slavery, the transatlantic slave trade got its start in Europe. My wife and I had the opportunity to travel to Ghana on the Gulf Coast, and I think the first, was it Portuguese fort that was there, or Dutch fort that was there, was built back in the 1400s. And so it's a really big place now, but you're talking about in the 1400s when the people first started coming to Africa and exporting slavery. And here in the United States, we know in the United States, they really only 300-some thousand slaves actually came to the United States. Most went to South America and to the Caribbean. The vast majority went to South America and the Caribbean. So about 300,000 came here to the United States. Yes, ma'am.
So you said you didn't know about like Juneteenth until you moved to Texas. Kind of what was like your journey with that, and did you live in Galveston?
I did not. We, my wife and I moved to Texas in 1993, and we had some really good friends there who really became our surrogate parents while we were there. And so when it came up to that time in June, it said, "So you all going to celebrate Juneteenth with us?" We were like, "What's a Juneteenth?" And we had no earthly idea. And then they told us about the history of it and how it came about. But you know, I think it's the way that history has taught sometime here in the United States. I was an adult before I learned about the Tuskegee Airmen. Yeah. And, you know, that esteemed group of flyers, and even being here in the South and really close to Tuskegee, Alabama, you know, I was an adult before I found out about that. And so, I mean, it's really unfortunate that, you know, being African American and you find out about Juneteenth when you're 30 years old and move to another state where it's a really big deal in Texas that you probably can imagine is a very big deal in Texas.
Like
So-
you said, it's kind of on the school system though.
Mm-hmm.
So when so it took so long for the news to reach Texas, and was it 2 years that it took from the day the emancipation was signed until it
2 years.
actually reached Texas?
Mm-hmm.
So that was the last group of people to get the news that in fact they were free.
Mm-hmm. I think right after the war ended in '65 is when they finally got the news. In Texas, and so yeah, that was quite a revelation for me to find that out at that time. I mean, I had no idea, you know. And now it's a national holiday, so so we were sort of embarrassed that we didn't know. But I'm not really sure how many people west of the Mississippi knew about it, you know, because I think my wife, she had never heard about it, and the folks that I grew up with in Tennessee, never heard anything about it. So that's really, really interesting how you have that dynamic in different parts of the country. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I got something that's related to what you were talking about the slavery being abolished in Europe. But I can't remember the year. When did the British Crown abolish slavery in the British Empire? There's you ever heard about that? They abolished slavery across the board. Of course, there's always an exception.
Right.
Crown colonies, and the U.S. was a crown colony.
Right.
And that was so the British.
Yes, it was England. It was Europe proper that it was forbidden.
Right.
But any place where they had colonized,
Right.
places in India and other places, they were still allowed to adhere
Right.
to carry that on.
Yep.
The tea companies and the
Yep.
It was in 1833, apparently.
1833. Yeah.
So, but what you had said though in other presentations, it was just, Lincoln wasn't formally educated, but that was one of the political things that he did. He knew there was no chance for Europe, because they had gone through these machinations to get rid of it, that it would exclude them. And he was a student of history, and he knew that one of the variants in the Revolutionary War was the French, the German soldiers and all that. Everybody wanted to take some sort of role in our war against Britain, and he saw that coming for this one as well.
Yes, ma'am.
You said you had the opportunity to travel to Ghana. What was that like to be able to go back and kind of see all of that?
Wow, it was quite an amazing experience. We've had a chance to travel to Africa a couple of times. I've been 3, and we went to South Africa first, and South Africa is like, Cape Town's like going to Atlanta.
Yeah.
But Ghana, and I think it can be very emotional because you hear and you learn really the sorrow that those people had to encounter. We went to Kumasi, which is in the northern part of Ghana, And, slave traders would actually, buy folks from the king. Some of the kings in Ghana and Africa were also involved in the slave trade. And the people would walk from there chained up from Kumasi to the coast, and they took it to this one place called the Slave River. And the Slave River to the castle was probably, I guess, about 5 or 6 miles. And so they would have them stop at the Slave River first to wash them up. They would wash them, clean them up, put some type of salve on them to make them look healthy. And then they would send them to the castle. And when she got to the castle, it was really sad, because in the castle, they have the dungeon area where they kept the men and they kept the women. And it's probably no bigger than this room. It's made of concrete. And, I'm pretty sure at night it's really dark and it gets pretty hot in there. It was just 2 people and it got really hot. I mean, there's no bathroom facility. So the people, they use the bathroom on the floor, and they just, they had to sleep and I think the dichotomy of something like that is that on the top part of the castle, or they call it castle, is a church. And the church sits on top of the dungeons, where you got human beings down there suffering and sweating, and so when you try to put those two things together, how do you kind of force yourself to not see people as human beings, and then you up in the church and you worshiping the God who made them at the same time. And so that that's the part where it gets really, really emotional. Yeah, it's a really eerie feeling when you go through and you see the gate of no return. The folks who went through there never got to see their families again, and so that part of it was really emotional. It was a life-changing, for me, it was a life-changing experience. And so, we would go again if we had the opportunity to, but.
You said it was the Dutch, the first one was Dutch?
I think it was the Dutch that first settled there. And then I think the Portuguese came at one time. And so it really evolved. It really evolved like that. But, and I think that was back in the 1400s, I think, when all that happened.
That's right. I think that's right.
Yeah, that was back in the 1400s when all that occurred. And so it took, I think that when the castle is present form, that might have been like in the 1600s when they finally went built to the way it looks right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, no problem.
Sounds like amazing in like a emotional way.
It was, it was amazing and emotional at the same time to, I'm here because, somebody survived the Atlantic, that transit. Somebody survived, and that's one of the reasons that.
That's crazy.
I mean, it is crazy when you think about it.
Like full body chills thinking about
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Have you been to Charleston, South
I
Carolina?
have been to Charleston. Charleston's a very interesting, a beautiful city. It's a very interesting city as well, and it still has some of the buildings where the slave markets occurred. And my brother, I have a younger brother who lives in North Charleston, and we've been there a few times. And it's a very historic and beautiful city, but a lot of deep history as far as the slave trade is concerned. I think, and I actually have a museum there that's, I think 40% of the African Americans that came to this country came through Charleston. So, and I think the other thing about the Emancipation Proclamation, well, I think just in general, from what I can ascertain, is how Lincoln evolved over time. It's not, when the war started, it's about keeping the Union together, which is very understandable. And then how it evolved and how he evolved as a person. And I think that's really an admirable, you can admire that about him as a person.
It was 1860 when he was campaigning, I am not going to stop
Right.
slavery.
Right.
Politicians will say anything.
Right.
And
They'll say
in his biography, in Abraham Lincoln's biography, as a young man, he was born in Hardin County, Kentucky, and because land surveying was in its infancy at the time, there were many lawsuits where his father had property, and then they moved to Indiana, and then they moved to Illinois. And the Saginaw River, he did a float trip down and it was very dangerous, down to New Orleans. And it was the first time that he ever saw a human being sold. And he said the two pivotal times in his life, one was when his family member killed a turkey out in front of their house, and he didn't like that. He didn't like the gunshot, the turkey drop. He didn't like that, but he, in several times in his life, he referred back to that, that no one man has the right to own another man. And he thought, you know, and he also wasn't a devoutly spiritual person.
Right.
He wasn't that guy. I mean, you know, but that early on in his life, he refers back to that. Mr. Hay was his biographer, you know, that followed him around and took notes and everything. And he said that was indelible. So I just wonder what you were saying as well. No offense to politicians, none in the room, I'm hoping, but I think he said what he had to say to get elected.
Yeah, of course.
But in his mind, he said, you know, there's no way for that to be right.
Right.
So anyway.
Yeah, you know, and I think we were discussing earlier, how do you go from, when you're a politician, especially now, how do you go from, you know, keeping your moral clarity and doing the right thing, you know, when you have all these interests and other things kind of going against you. And I'm pretty sure, I mean, it's real, I guess it's hard to imagine him being conflicted, I would think, because the country is at war and you just want the war to end and bring the country back together again. But, you know, those forces are still out there trying to divide the country. And I mean, very, very strong forces. And so how do you keep your moral clarity and do the right thing despite all the forces that come up against you? I mean, I would guess it would be even harder today when you have to raise so much money. We were talking about they had to raise so much money to run for office. And, you know, how do you do the right thing and not do the thing that, you know, that somebody may have who gave you $150,000? You know, they may want their favor, but you know, and do you still do the right thing, or do you do what's expedient?
Whatever. You're a one-term dog catcher.
Exactly.
You do the right thing because you ain't getting no more money.
Right. I mean, yes, exactly right.
But as Miss Linda says, we're children of the same God, so we're in the same family.
Right.
And there is more that unites us than separates us.
Amen.
And we only get in trouble when we focus on what separates us.
Amen. Amen to that. Anything else? Thank you all so much for listening today. Appreciate it.
Ken, thank you for that. Appreciate you being here and telling us more about the work of that committee. Lance mentioned Linda. We had Linda Kellogg here last year talking about the MLK committee in Bartow County. Appreciate the work that you all do in educating and keeping that legacy alive.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us a little bit about the organization itself? Where do y'all meet? How often do you meet? What are your goals? And what do you see in the future?
So we meet mostly virtually, and that really came about because of COVID when we couldn't get together. You know, a lot of the members, my wife and I are probably youngest folks in the committee right now, and that's one of the reasons that Ms. Robinson asked us to join, because she knew some of the folks in the committee were getting a little bit older. And I mean, our goal is basically to continue the commemoration. I mean, it's over 90 years that this community has thought it proper to do so, and we want to keep it going as long as we can, because I think, again, the Emancipation Proclamation was a very, very important document in the history of the United States. Like I said, in my opinion, we wouldn't have had the 13, 14, or 15 amendments without it, in my opinion. And so that's really the goal, to keep it going. Now, my hope in the next few years or so that we can get some younger people to kind of come along and, you know, maybe maybe enhance it some. You know, we kind of follow the same format each year, and I think that one of the great things is that the citizens of Bartow County support it. We typically get about 100 people at each one that we do, and so sometimes they bring their kids or their grandkids to the program, and I think it's important like I said, I wish I could have found out a lot more about how it got started and what was the reasons behind it. So I know it has to be a reason why they started in 1929. But I think doing anything for over 90 years is really incredible. Now, they didn't meet every year. I think at first, as I counted the years that they had documented, it's probably like 10 times that they didn't meet over the past 90 years. I'm not really sure why. I think during World War II they didn't meet. A couple years they didn't meet. But I think having that type of legacy for anything over that period of time is really incredible. And I hope hopefully they'll keep that going for the next 90 years and not something that we'll forget. And we try to keep the program to a point where it's upbeat. It's uplifting, and that anybody's invited, that anybody wants to come. That really just to kind of learn about, what the program, what the proclamation meant to this country.
You mentioned it moves around churches each year?
We do. We seek out churches in the format we have. We try to pick a church in the city limits, and then we try to pick a church in the county, and we'll ask several pastors if it's okay to come there and have the program at their church. Most of the time they're fine with it. We do ask the pastor if they would like to bring the message, because it seems kind of strange bringing somebody else to talk. But some pastors don't mind doing that, and so that's usually the way we do it. So we were in the city this year, and I think we're going to try to go outside to a county, one of the African American county churches, this next year. But the program is not really hard to put together. Like I said, the most difficult thing is trying to get a speaker and trying to find a church, and everything else usually kind of falls in place. But I think just getting younger people involved and engaged and to continue this legacy is really the thing that I'm really concerned about. So, like I said, it doesn't take a whole lot of work, but I think it's important work to commemorate it every year. So. I think Ms. Kellogg has a lot more difficult time than I do with the MLK program. So, thank you all. Thank you so
Great
much.
job.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for